$5 for dead land?
Garen Holt laughed so hard the hardware store went quiet. Wade Mercer stood at the counter, dust on his boots, Rook watching from the truck outside.
You bought Blue Scar a lot?
Garen stepped closer.
That spring is poison, soldier. Even cattle know better.
Wade folded the receipt.
It has water. Blue water.
Garen snapped.
And that dog will know the danger before you do.
Wade said nothing. Then Rook suddenly stood, staring toward the limestone hills. Nobody knew that Dog had already found the first clue the whole town had missed. 2 weeks earlier, none of this had happened yet. Nobody signed over a farm to me. Nobody called from a law office with news that some forgotten uncle had left me a clean deed and a second chance. I did not stumble into luck, dressed up as inheritance. By the time I walked into the Cedar Hollow County office in early May of 2019, what I owned could fit in the cab of my old gray pickup, a tool bag with 2 missing sockets, a folded tarp, 3 shirts, a dented coffee thermos, $5 in cash for the deed, a little odd job money left on a debit card, and Rook sitting in the passenger seat like he had more faith in me than I had earned. Rook was a 6-year-old German shepherd with 1 torn ear, a black saddle across his back, and eyes that studied people too carefully. He had been with me through the years after the service, through repair jobs that lasted 2 weeks, motel rooms I could not afford, and mornings when I drove nowhere just so I would not have to admit I had nowhere to go. People in small towns notice a man like that. They notice the boots before the face, the truck before the hands, the dog before the silence. They decide what you are before you speak. Cedar Hollow, Kentucky was no different. It sat in a fold of limestone hills, a place of feed stores, church signs, rusted gates, and people who knew the history of land better than they knew the people standing in front of them. The county office smelled like old paper, floor wax, and coffee burned down to bitterness. Behind the counter sat Linus Duval, a narrow-shouldered man with silver hair, combed flat and glasses that seemed to make him look both tired and suspicious. I asked him for the cheapest parcel the county had left. He looked at me over the rims of his glasses, then looked past me at Rook, waiting outside the glass door. "Cheapest is not the same as usable," he said. I asked for cheapest. He sighed, opened a metal drawer, and pulled out a thin folder that looked as though nobody had touched it in years. The label was faded, but I could still read the words. Blue Scar Lot, 3 acres, county held after tax forfeiture. No structure, no private owner of record, minimum bid, $5. Linus laid it on the counter, but kept 2 fingers on the folder, as if even paper could be dangerous if it belonged to the wrong land. "That place is behind the old quarry road," he said. "Past the gravel bend, under the south bluff. People call it dead ground." I waited. Men like Linus always had a second sentence. "There is water on it," he added. "A spring. That should have made the land worth something." In that country, water was not a detail. Water was the difference between a field and a punishment. But Linus said the word spring the way another man might say snake. "What is wrong with it?" I asked. He leaned back and the chair complained under him. "It is blue, not muddy blue, not sky blue." He explained it like someone repeating a warning he had inherited from men already buried. The spring came out from under a limestone wall and pooled in a hollow below the bluff. The water was clear, cold, and colored a strange glassy blue. Some said metal from the old quarry bled into it. Some said livestock would not drink from it. Some said tomatoes planted near it curled black at the edges. The last 2 owners had signed papers, walked the land once, and let the taxes rot. "You do not want it," Linus said. "A man with $5 cannot afford a bad mistake." I looked through the glass door. Rook was standing now, ears forward, nose lifted, staring past the parked trucks toward the hills, as if he had heard something calling from under the rock. I had known men who warned you because they cared, and men who warned you because they liked owning the gate. I could not tell which one Linus was, maybe both. "Does it have water?" I asked. Linus frowned. "I told you. It has blue water." I took the folded 5 from my shirt pocket and smoothed it on the counter. It was soft from being carried too long. "Then it has water." He did not move for a moment. I saw pity cross his face, then irritation, then the tired look of a man who had learned that people usually have to touch the stove themselves. He stamped the form, turned it around, and showed me where to sign. My hand did not shake, but something inside me did. Not hope exactly. Hope was too clean a word for what I felt. It was more like hunger with its back straight. When I stepped outside with the deed folded into my pocket, Rook pressed his shoulder against my leg. The hills beyond town were pale green in the heat, and somewhere behind them was a piece of land nobody wanted, holding a blue spring nobody trusted. I did not know then what that water was. I did not know why the ground around it had been feared for so long, or why Rook would be the first living thing to show me where to look. All I knew was that for $5, Cedar Hollow had sold me its oldest mistake, and I had bought it before anyone could change their mind. Wade had not always been a man people stepped around. For 12 years he had been useful in ways that were easy to measure. In the Army, his hands had mattered. He could repair a pump with sand in the threads, read the slope of a wash before rain made a mess of it, set posts straight by eye, cut drainage through hard clay, and tell from the color of soil whether water would sit, run, or disappear. He was not a loud soldier, not the kind who filled a room with stories. He was the kind commanders sent for when something had to work by morning, and there was no spare part coming. A busted generator, a flooded access road, a cracked culvert, a fence line dropped by wind, Wade Mercer could usually make it hold. That kind of usefulness follows a man for a while after he leaves the service, but it does not always translate into ordinary life. Civilian work wanted references, small talk, patience with supervisors who called him buddy, while watching him like he might break. He found jobs, then lost them. Fence crew in Bowling Green, pump repair outside Somerset, part-time delivery, a few weeks patching roofs, 3 months maintaining equipment at a quarry, until the owner decided Wade's silence meant attitude. Silence was the thing people misunderstood most. They thought quiet meant anger. They thought old boots meant failure. They thought the pickup with primer on one door and a German shepherd in the passenger seat meant trouble had arrived before Wade ever put a hand on the counter. He learned to see the judgment coming. It moved across faces in small weather patterns. A glance at his clothes, a pause at Rook's size, a softening of the voice that was not kindness but caution. Wade hated pity more than insult. An insult at least stood upright. Pity leaned on you. It touched your shoulder without asking and called itself mercy. He did not want to be somebody's sad story. He did not want a free sandwich handed over with a sigh, or a church basement cot offered by a man who made sure everyone heard him offer it. He wanted work. He wanted room. He wanted one square of earth where his value did not have to be explained before breakfast. Rook never required an explanation. The dog had come to him from a veteran support kennel in Tennessee, all ribs and suspicion at first, with a torn ear and a habit of sleeping facing the door. Wade understood that. In the beginning, Rook did not lean against him. He simply stayed close. Close enough to say I am here, not so close as to demand gratitude. Over time, the dog learned the sound of Wade's breathing before a bad hour. He learned when to press his shoulder into Wade's knee, when to bring him outside, when to block a doorway with that calm, stubborn body until Wade put on his boots and stepped into open air. They were not master and pet in the way people liked to say it. They were two creatures who had been trained to watch for danger, and then had to learn what to do when no danger was visible, only memory. During the worst months, they slept in the pickup behind closed gas stations and at the edges of gravel lots, where nobody asked questions if you left before sunrise. Wade would wake with his neck stiff and his hand already resting on Rook's back. The dog's breathing was slow and steady, a small engine of trust in the dark cab. Some mornings Wade would sit there with the key in his hand and no idea where to turn it. A man can be alive and still feel unplaced, like a tool left outside after the work is done. That was the feeling he carried into Cedar Hollow. Not despair, not exactly. Despair was too dramatic for what he had. His was quieter, heavier, a tiredness from being treated as temporary everywhere he went. The $5 land was not a dream of wealth. Wade did not imagine crates of vegetables, rows of green, or people driving in from neighboring counties to ask him how he had done it. When Linus Duval slid that folder across the counter, Wade saw something simpler and more necessary. 3 acres meant no landlord. A spring, even a strange one, meant water might be near. A dead lot meant nobody would hurry to take it from him. Maybe the ground was bad. Maybe the stories were true. Maybe the blue water was a mistake, sleeping under stone. But Wade knew something about things called damaged by people who never bothered to understand them. He knew a man could look rough and still have steady hands. He knew a dog could look dangerous and still be the gentlest living thing in the room. And maybe, though he would not have said it out loud then, he wondered if land could be the same way. Misread, avoided, waiting. So he bought Blue Scar Lot not because he believed it would save him, but because he was tired of asking permission to remain. He wanted a place where no one could point to the door. He wanted a morning where the first voice he heard was not telling him he did not fit. He wanted to stand on a piece of American ground with Rook beside him and feel for once that being unfinished did not mean being unwanted. The road to Blue Scar Lot was less a road than a memory of one. Wade found it behind the old quarry turnoff, where the county pavement broke into gravel. The gravel thinned into packed red dirt, and the dirt became 2 pale tracks running through broom sedge and blackberry cane. Dust rose behind the pickup and hung in the heat like flowers shaken into sunlight. Rook stood with his front paws braced on the floorboard, nose close to the half-open window, taking in every smell before Wade could even see the land. That was how Rook read the world. Not by what people had said about it, not by what signs warned, not by what names had been hung on a place, but by what was actually there. Wade envied that. He stopped at a sagging wire gate held shut with a chain and a bent nail. The gate leaned so far inward it seemed tired of guarding anything. Beyond it lay 3 acres of almost nothing. Dry grass, cedar scrub, limestone chips scattered white as old bone, a pump shed with half its roof peeled back, and a fence line that had given up in sections. No house, no power pole, no mailbox, no mark that anyone had ever loved the place long enough to improve it. At the far edge, the land rose suddenly into a pale gray limestone bluff, its face cracked and streaked, with cedar roots gripping pockets of rock like hands refusing to let go. Wade got out and stood still. He had seen rough land before. He had seen neglected land, abused land, land stripped for timber or cut open for stone. But this place had a particular silence to it. Not dead exactly. Waiting maybe, or listening. Rook jumped down from the cab, shook dust from his coat, and moved ahead with his nose low. Wade followed him past the pump shed, past a rusted length of pipe half buried in weeds, past a patch of ground where nothing grew but gray moss and brittle stems. Then he saw the spring. It sat at the base of the bluff in a round stone hollow, fed by a dark slit in the limestone. The water was blue, but not the honest blue of sky reflected in a pond. This blue seemed to come from underneath, as if the stone itself were giving off light. In direct sun, it flashed green-blue, the color of old glass bottles held up to a window. Under the shadow of the bluff, it deepened toward ink, clear and dark at the same time. Wade had meant to be practical when he arrived. Check the boundaries, inspect the shed, look for drainage, see whether the spring had flow or only color. But the pool stopped him in place. It was beautiful in the way some dangerous things are beautiful before you know whether they mean harm. He crouched near the edge, careful not to lean too far. The water was so clear he could see small stones on the bottom, each one filmed with a faint pale blue coating. No oil sheen, no rotten smell, no dead insects floating thick on the surface. He dipped 2 fingers in. Cold shot up his hand so sharply he pulled back before he meant to. Clean cold, stone cold, water that had been underground long enough to forget the weather. He brought his wet fingers close to his face and smelled them. Damp limestone, a trace of metal thin and distant, like touching an old tool left out in rain. Nothing like sulfur, nothing like fuel. Still, he did not drink. He was not a fool, and he had not survived this long by treating mystery as permission. Rook came to the pool, lowered his head, then stopped. His ears angled forward. He sniffed the water, stepped left, stepped right, and backed away. Wade felt a small disappointment tighten in his chest. Animals knew things. Maybe Linus had been right. Maybe every story in Cedar Hollow had started with a dog or a cow, making the same choice Rook had just made. But Rook did not leave the spring. He began to circle the bluff, moving slowly, nose along the cracks where damp moss darkened the stone. Wade followed, pushing through cedar branches until the dog climbed a small rise of rock above the pool. There, almost hidden behind fern and loose limestone, a thread of water slipped from a narrow seam before falling toward the blue hollow below. It was barely more than a trickle, clear at the point of birth, not yet gathered into that strange glass color. Rook lowered his head and drank. No hesitation, no growl, no recoil. He drank, lifted his muzzle with water shining on his whiskers, then folded himself down beside the seam as calmly as if he had found shade on a familiar porch. Wade let him have that first drink, then kept his bowl filled with town water until he knew what they were dealing with. Wade stood above him with one hand on the bluff. The difference was small, but it mattered. Rook had refused the pool and chosen the source. People had seen the color after the water gathered. Rook had searched for where it began. Wade looked from the clear trickle to the blue hollow below, and something inside him shifted, not into belief, not yet, but into attention. Maybe Cedar Hollow had been staring at the wrong part of the story for years. Maybe fear had made them stop at the color, when the truth was somewhere higher in the rock, quieter, narrower, waiting for something patient enough to follow the flow backward. Wade spent the first night on Blue Scar Lot, listening to the land make small sounds in the dark. The pump shed was barely a shelter, more shadow than building, with one wall bowed outward and a roof that let the moon through in thin silver strips. He patched what he could before sundown, dragging a sheet of rusted tin over the worst gap, tying a tarp from a roof beam to an old shelf bracket, and sweeping out leaves, mouse droppings, and a layer of dust so fine it rose around his boots like smoke. He set his tool bag against the driest wall, placed Rook's water bowl beside the door, and rolled his blanket on a patch of floor that did not sag when he pressed it with his heel. It was not a home, not yet. But it was a place where no one knocked to tell him to leave, and that counted for more than comfort. In the morning, he drove back into Cedar Hollow with dirt on his jeans and bought what his $5 deed had not included: 2 plastic water drums, A cheap notebook, a pencil, 2 Brandywine tomato seedlings, a tray of bell pepper starts, bush beans, yellow squash, basil, and parsley. The woman at the register looked at the seed packets and starter trays, then at him, then out the window toward his truck where Rook waited. "Planting out there?" she asked. Wade did not ask how she knew. Cedar Hollow had already carried his business from the county office to the hardware aisle. Trying something, he said. That was all. Trying something was safer than hoping. Back at the lot, he picked a flat stretch of ground between the pump shed and the bluff, where the soil looked thin, but not completely hopeless. It broke under the shovel in gray plates, hard on top, powdery beneath, with small limestone chips mixed through it. He worked slowly, turning the ground 1 square at a time, pulling roots, setting stones aside, stopping when his shoulder tightened. Rook stayed close, but not in the way, lying under a cedar and watching the shovel rise and fall. By noon, Wade had made 2 narrow beds, each no longer than a truck hood and no wider than his reach. He bordered them with limestone pieces, so he would not confuse one for the other. The left bed he marked with a strip of blue tape tied to a cedar twig. The right bed he marked with plain twine, blue for the spring, twine for town water. He planted the same seeds and starts in each bed, measured by the same hand, covered with the same soil, and pressed each row flat with the back of his fingers. Then he carried water from the source Rook had found, not the blue pool below, but the narrow seam above it, where the water first slipped clean from the rock. It took longer that way. The path was uneven, the bucket heavy, and by the 3rd trip, his palm had a red line where the handle bit into it. For the other bed, he used water hauled from Cedar Hollow in the plastic drum. Ordinary water with an ordinary smell, warm from the ride in the truck. The first days taught him almost nothing. Seeds are quiet before they decide, and seedlings do not confess their secrets all at once. Wade checked the beds at sunrise and again near dusk, writing down the date, the weather, how much he watered, how the soil felt when he pushed one finger into it. He did not trust excitement. He had known too many men who mistook wanting for knowing. On the 5th morning, the first bean hooks broke through in both beds. By the 6th, the tomato starts had lifted their leaves toward the light instead of hanging limp in the heat. On the 8th, Wade began to see what he did not want to name too quickly. The blue water bed stood a little straighter. The bean leaves were thicker, darker, with a sheen that caught the morning light. The tomatoes in that bed did not look taller by much, but they looked more certain of themselves. Their stems faintly purple and firm, their leaves spread wide, as if they had found something under the surface worth reaching for. The town water bed was alive too, and Wade was careful not to insult it in his notes. Alive was no small thing. But the soil around those seedlings stayed pale and crusted. Around the blue water plants, the ground changed texture after watering. It darkened, loosened, and held a cool, clean smell like damp stone and fresh-cut stems. Wade crouched there a long time with the notebook balanced on his knee. He felt a flicker rise in his chest and pressed it down. Not yet. 1 good week was not proof. One strange bed was not a miracle. He measured the tallest bean with a tape. He counted leaves. He drew a rough map of each row. Rook came from the cedar shade, sniffed both beds, and without hesitation lay down beside the one marked with blue tape. His chin rested between his paws, his eyes half closed, his body relaxed in the careful way of a guard who has chosen what matters. Wade looked at the dog, then at the bluff, then at the thin thread of water flashing above the pool. For the first time since he signed the deed, the word dead sounded less like a fact, and more like something people had said, because they ran out of patience before the land finished speaking. By the second week, Cedar Hollow knew Wade Mercer had taken the old road out to Blue Scar Lot and stayed there. A town that small could carry a rumor faster than rainwater down a ditch. And by then the rumor had improved itself in the telling. Wade had not just bought Blue Scar Lot. He had moved onto it. He had not just touched the spring. He was watering seeds with it. He had not just brought a dog. He had brought a German shepherd big enough, one man said, to drag a deputy through a door if it took a notion. Wade heard all of it in pieces when he came into town for supplies. The hardware store sat beside the feed store, with a bell on the door and a floor worn smooth where generations of boots had stood judging weather, crops, and other people's mistakes. Wade needed fence wire, a handful of steel posts, hose clamps, and the cheapest length of black irrigation tubing on the bottom shelf. He had counted his cash twice before walking in. Near the nails, 3 men stopped talking when he entered, then started again with their voices tilted just high enough for him to hear. "There he is," one said. "The $5 soldier." Another laughed into his coffee. "Living out there with that blue water. Won't be long before he starts glowing." The third looked through the front window at Rook, waiting in the strip of shade beside the truck, calm as a stone statue. Dog's probably smarter than him. At least that thing knows to bark when something ain't right. Wade kept his eyes on the shelf. He had learned that some words were bait, and a tired man could lose more than his temper by biting. He picked up the wire, checked the price tag, set it back, chose a smaller roll, then carried it to the counter. That was when Garin Holt stepped into the aisle. Garin owned 40 acres east of town and had the permanent squint of a man who believed sunlight and other people were usually up to something. His shirt was clean, his belt buckle polished, his hands broad and nicked from real work. Wade respected work when he saw it. He did not have to like the man wearing it. "You're wasting your time," Garin said, not unkindly enough to be called cruel, and not kindly enough to be called honest. "That ground was bad before you got here. My father knew it. His father knew it. Folks tried that place and left it for a reason." Wade said nothing. If that blue spring was worth anything, somebody with sense would have used it by now. There it was, the oldest argument in the world, dressed up as wisdom. If a thing had value, surely the right people would already have taken it. Wade looked at Garin for a second, long enough to notice the man was not angry. He was certain. Certainty was harder to move than anger. "Maybe," Wade said. He paid for the wire, the posts, and the tubing, then tucked the receipt into his shirt pocket. The bell rang again as he stepped outside. Rook stood when he saw him, tail low, eyes on Wade's face. Dogs know the weight of a room, even when they never enter it. Wade put a hand on Rook's head and let it rest there until the tightness in his jaw eased. He was loading the supplies when Mara Voss came from the feed store next door, carrying a sack of mineral salt over one shoulder, like it weighed less than her opinion. Mara was in her 60s, square-built, with gray hair cut short, and a voice that made people stand straighter without knowing why. "They giving you a hard time?" she asked. Wade tightened a strap over the posts. "Nothing I can't carry. That's not what I asked." He glanced at her, and for some reason the plainness of her question made him more tired than the men inside had. Mara looked toward the hills, toward the hidden road that led to Blue Scar. "I don't know about that spring," she said. "I don't pretend to, but I know a man working when I see one. A person starting over doesn't need the whole town to understand him on the first day." Wade did not answer right away. The words landed too close to something he had been trying not to name. Mara handed him a small paper bag. Inside were 2 packets of tomato steaks she had not charged him for. "Pay me when the dead ground grows something," she said, and walked back inside before he could refuse. That evening, Wade set the new posts along the garden beds and ran a low line of wire to keep the deer from browsing the seedlings. The blue water plants had lifted a little higher, not enough to brag about, but enough for Wade to notice. The others were still alive, but they seemed to be waiting for permission the first bed had already received. After sundown, he sat on an overturned bucket outside the pump shed. Rook lay across his boots, warm and heavy, and below the bluff the spring moved in its small, steady way. It did not argue with the town. It did not explain its color. It did not defend itself against 100 years of being called wrong. It simply kept coming out of the stone, clear at the source, blue in the hollow, patient as anything that knows what it is. Wade watched that water until the dark softened the edges of the land. He saw then, with a discomfort that felt almost like recognition, that he and the spring had been judged by the same lazy eye. Strange color, rough shape, bad history, stay away. Maybe the town was not afraid of poison as much as it was afraid of being mistaken. And maybe Wade was too. The first old thing Rook found was not a box or a name or anything a man could hold up and call evidence. It was a line. Wade would have missed it if the dog had not refused to leave it alone. The afternoon was hot enough to press the sound out of everything. Even the insects seemed to buzz lower, as if the air had weight. Wade had been cutting back cedar roots near the pump shed, trying to clear a path for the irrigation tube, when Rook walked to a bare patch of ground and began pawing at it with slow, careful strokes. Not digging the way a dog digs after a scent, not tearing dirt in every direction, more like scratching at a closed door. Wade watched him for a minute. What is it? Rook looked back once, ears up, then scraped again. Wade set down the brush hook and came over. The ground there looked no different from the rest of the lot. Hard gray soil, brittle grass, limestone flakes, a few stubborn roots. He pushed the shovel in and struck something flat before the blade went more than 3 inches down. The sound was clean and wrong. Stone, but placed stone. He knelt and cleared the dirt by hand. One flat limestone slab appeared, then another beside it, then another, all set in a narrow row under packed mud and roots. Wade felt the air change around him, though nothing moved. Natural rock did not arrange itself in a line that's straight. He worked until sweat ran off his jaw and darkened the dust on his shirt. By sundown, he had uncovered nearly 8 feet of an old channel, shallow and narrow, built from flat pieces of limestone fitted together with the patience of somebody who expected water to obey. The next morning he followed it. The buried run led from the rise below the spring source, curved past the pump shed, and aimed toward the south end of the lot, where the ground flattened into a rough patch he had not bothered with, because it looked poorer than the rest. Yellow grass, cracked soil, nothing inviting. But when Wade cut into that ground with the shovel, the top layer broke apart and revealed darker earth beneath. Not rich exactly, but different, softer, holding moisture like a memory. He stood there, with both hands on the shovel handle. For weeks he had thought he was discovering something new. Now the land seemed to be telling him, quietly and without pride, that someone had known before him. 3 days later, Rook found the second old thing. Rain had threatened all morning but never fallen, leaving the sky low and colorless. Wade was inside the pump shed, patching a split board near the back wall, when Rook came in and put his nose to the floor. He sniffed along the boards, stopped near a corner where the wood had sagged, and gave one short bark. Wade pried up the loose plank with a flat bar. Beneath it lay a rusted tin box, wedged between 2 floor joists, wrapped once in cloth that had gone brown with age. There was no lock, no money inside, no jewelry, no deed that changed his fortune. Just a small notebook, a pencil worn nearly to the end, and several folded pages spotted with mildew. The first page carried a name written in a steady hand: Ansel Whitcomb, 1958. Wade sat on the shed floor while Rook lowered himself beside him, and he read until the light began to fade. Ansel had measured rainfall. He had drawn crude maps of the spring, the channel, the south patch, the lower pool. He had listed beans, tomatoes, squash, peppers, clover. He had written down what grew with well water and what grew with the blue spring water. Again and again, in plain words that grew shakier over the years, one sentence returned: "This ground is not dead. People have just been giving it the wrong water." Wade read that line 3 times. It did not feel like a discovery. It felt like meeting a man too late to shake his hand. The notes told the rest in fragments. Ansel had tried to show neighbors the difference. Some laughed. Some warned him the water would make people sick. Some said a man living alone under the bluff had no business advising farmers whose families had worked land for generations. Without lab tests, without a title people respected, without the right voice for a town that had already made up its mind, Ansel's proof never became truth. Eventually the notes stopped. The channel filled. The pump shed sagged. The story of bad water remained because fear requires less maintenance than understanding. Wade closed the notebook and rested it on his knee. Outside, the blue spring kept moving under the bluff, carrying whatever it had always carried. Rook pressed his shoulder against Wade's leg, warm and steady. Wade looked at the dog, then at the uncovered channel, and felt something deeper than excitement. Anger was in it, yes, but not the hot kind. A sad, quiet anger for a man dismissed until his work disappeared under roots. And underneath that, a responsibility Wade had not expected to inherit. Not land from family. Not money. Something heavier. The obligation to listen better than the people before him had listened. Wade could have turned the spring into a story before he ever knew what it was. Cedar Hollow would have helped him do it, in its own backwards way. A man only had to let people whisper long enough, and soon the whisper would grow legs. Blue water that made dead land green. A veteran living under a bluff. A German shepherd that knew where the good water came from. An old notebook hidden in a shed floor. There was a kind of power in that, and Wade felt the temptation of it more than he liked to admit. A strange story could draw buyers. It could bring reporters from 2 counties over. It could put cash in his pocket faster than tomatoes ever would. But Ansel Whitcomb's notebook sat on the shelf above his bedroll, and every time Wade looked at it, he remembered what happened when truth was left naked without proof. People either laughed at it or dressed it in superstition. Wade wanted neither. So he gathered what he had: jars of water from the blue pool, jars from the upper seam Rook had found, soil from both garden beds, photographs of the plants taken beside a measuring tape, and 3 copied pages from Ansel's notebook sealed in a plastic sleeve. He drove to the county extension office on a Thursday morning, with Rook in the truck and dust still on his boots. The woman at the front desk was polite in the way offices are polite when they have already decided where a man belongs in the line of importance. She listened, nodded, took the jars, and set them aside as if they might become someone else's concern later. "We'll see what we can do," she said. Wade had heard that sentence before. It was the sound of a door closing softly. He left without arguing. On his way back through town, he stopped at Mara Voss's feed store to buy dog food he could barely afford. Mara watched him lift the bag with one hand and hold the folder of notes with the other. "They didn't take you seriously," she said. Wade gave a tired half-smile. "They took the jars. That isn't the same thing." She was quiet for a moment, then reached for a card pinned beside the register. "I know someone at the State University. Dr. Hallie Renner. Water and rock are her business. She came through here years ago after a sinkhole opened behind the fairground. Wade looked at the name. Why would she come for this? Mara pushed the card across the counter. Because somebody ought to look before everybody talks, Doctor. Renner arrived 12 days later in a white university truck with mud already on the tires. She was not what Wade expected. No bright speech, no practiced wonder, no quick dismissal. She wore field pants, sun-faded boots, and a canvas hat with a sweat line around the band. When Wade showed her the spring, she did not say beautiful first. She said interesting, which somehow meant more. She knelt at the lower pool, took a sample, measured pH, conductivity, temperature, dissolved solids. Then Rook stood, walked toward the bluff trail, and looked back. Dr. Renner noticed. Does he always do that? Only when he thinks we're missing the point. The dog led them to the upper seam. There, Dr. Renner's expression changed by 1 degree, not enough for most people to see, but Wade saw it. She took 3 samples from the source, 2 from the channel he had uncovered, and soil from the south patch, where the old irrigation had once run. She asked about rainfall, quarry history, old wells, plant response, livestock behavior, and the notebook. Wade answered what he could and admitted what he could not. That seemed to please her more than guessing would have. When the results came back, she returned in person. Wade knew then it mattered. People did not drive out under a limestone bluff to say nothing. She sat with him on an overturned crate outside the pump shed, while Rook lay between them. Nose pointed toward the spring. "It is not mine waste," she said. Wade let out breath he had not known he was holding. The color appears to come from naturally occurring iron phosphate compounds in the limestone system. The concentration is low, but mineral traces collect in the pool and make the blue look stronger. The chemistry is unusual, but not automatically dangerous. She showed him the report. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, iron, manganese, zinc trace minerals. Not magic, not poison. A mineral-heavy spring moving through old limestone, carrying what poor soil had been missing. Used carefully, she said. This water could improve depleted ground, not everywhere, not in unlimited amounts, and I would not tell people to drink it casually. That was enough for Wade. From then on, the spring was for soil first, not for showing off, but for soil restoration, especially on thin, mineral-poor land. There is real value here. Wade looked toward the blue hollow. The spring kept shining under the bluff, unchanged by being understood. That was the strange thing about truth. It did not become larger when named. It simply became harder to dismiss. Rook lifted his head, ears soft, eyes on Wade, as if waiting for him to catch up with what the dog had known from the beginning. Wade rested a hand on the rough fur behind his neck and spoke so quietly Dr. Renner may not have heard. "You knew before they did, didn't you?" Rook leaned into his hand, and for the first time Wade allowed himself to feel not triumph but relief. The land was not asking him to believe in miracles. It was asking him to pay attention. Wade did not put up a sign. He did not call the local paper, did not post photographs, did not tell the men at the hardware store they had been wrong. The report from Dr. Renner stayed folded in a plastic sleeve inside the pump shed. Beside Ansel Whitcomb's notebook, 2 pieces of proof separated by 60 years and the same stubborn water. Wade read them both at night, when the heat loosened its grip and the bluff turned purple in the last light. Then he got up the next morning and worked. That was the only way he knew to answer anything. He cleared the old channel Rook had uncovered, lifting out roots, mud, and flat stones shifted by decades of neglect. Some stones still fit together so neatly that Wade could feel Ansel's hands in the work, not as a ghost, but as a kind of patience left behind. Where slabs were missing, Wade cut and set new limestone from the edge of the bluff. He did not open the spring wide. Dr. Renner's warning stayed with him. Good water could be ruined by greed as quickly as bad water could ruin a field. So he guided only a narrow thread from the upper seam into the restored channel, enough to darken the beds, never enough to flood them. Rook followed the water the first day it ran the old course again. The dog walked beside the channel with his nose low, stopping at each place where water slipped over stone, then trotted ahead to the south patch, and stood there waiting as the first thin ribbon arrived. It soaked into the hard earth without drama, no thunder, no bright burst of green, just water entering ground that had been thirsty longer than Wade had been alive. The change came the way real change usually comes, too slowly for impatient people and too steadily to deny. By late summer, the tomato plants stood higher than Wade's belt, with stems thick enough that the cheap stakes bent under their weight. Their leaves were dark and broad, not the artificial green of overfed plants, but a deep working green, the color of something well supplied and busy. The beans climbed the twine until they ran out of twine and began reaching for the fence. Squash vines crossed the limestone borders and set heavy yellow blossoms that bees found before Wade had finished his morning coffee. The basil was so strong that brushing past it filled the air with pepper and sweetness. Parsley came up dense. Peppers shone under the leaves like small green lanterns. But it was not the size of the plants that moved him most. It was the small arrivals, the first earthworm curling in soil that had once broken like ash, the first pair of finches on the crooked fence, the first bee working a squash blossom so hard its whole body disappeared in gold dust. Wade knelt one morning with a handful of darkened soil and felt something in his throat tighten. No medal, no handshake, no job title had ever struck him the way that worm did. Life had returned quietly, without asking the town's permission. When Wade finally brought produce to the Cedar Hollow farmers market, he arrived early, parked at the end of the row, and set 3 wooden crates on a folding table Mara Voss had loaned him. Tomatoes, beans, herbs, squash, nothing fancy, no banner, no speech. Rook lay beneath the table with his paws crossed, watching boots move past. At first, people bought from Wade the way people touch a hot pan, carefully and with witnesses. They wanted to say they had tried the Blue Spring tomatoes. They wanted a story for supper. A woman named Nelda Price picked up one of the tomatoes, turned it in both hands, and said it felt too heavy for its size. Wade almost apologized, though he did not know for what. She took a bite right there, juice running over her thumb, and went still. Her eyes changed before her mouth did. For a second, Wade thought something was wrong. Then she swallowed and looked toward the hills beyond town. "I have not tasted anything like that since my family farm was still standing," she said. She bought 6 more. By the next market day, she had told enough people that Wade sold out before noon. Curiosity brought them. Flavor brought them back. The men from the hardware store came one at a time, never together, each pretending he had simply been passing by. Garin Holt arrived near closing with his hat low and his hands in his pockets. He stood in front of the table, looked at the last small bag of beans, then at Wade. No apology came. Wade had not expected one. Garin paid full price, took the bag, and gave a single nod, stiff and uncomfortable, but real. Wade nodded back. Some men had to reach respect by walking through pride first, and Wade knew better than to block the road just because the first step was small. Under the table, Rook thumped his tail once against the dust, as if he had heard the sound of something beginning to change. The first man who asked to buy the water brought his own jug. That was how Wade knew the story had changed shape. A season earlier, nobody in Cedar Hollow wanted to stand too close to the Blue Spring. Now a man in a Clean Seed Company cap set a 5-gallon container on Wade's market table and asked what Wade would charge to fill it. He said it casually, but his eyes were sharp. 2 days later, a woman from the West Ridge offered to pay by the week if Wade would let her draw water for her garden. Then a restaurant owner from the next county asked whether Wade could supply that blue stuff for herbs. He meant well, probably. Most people did, when value appeared where they had expected failure. But Wade felt something in him go still. There was money in the spring now, or at least the smell of it. And money has a way of making people forget what they were afraid of yesterday. That evening he sat inside the pump shed, with Ansel Whitcomb's notebook open on his knees. Rook lay near the doorway, chin on his paws, watching the last light drain off the bluff. Wade read the same sentence again, the one Ansel had written so many times it seemed less like a note and more like a plea. This ground is not dead. People have just been giving it the wrong water. Ansel had tried to tell them. He had tried to share what he saw. The town had laughed, and the truth had gone underground with the channel. Wade did not want to make the opposite mistake. He did not want to hide the truth so tightly in his own fist that it died there too. The next Saturday he set out 6 rough benches under the shade beside the pump shed. Mara Voss brought a clipboard and a coffee urn. Dr. Renner came with printed safety notes and a cooler of sample bottles. Wade brought buckets of soil, gray hardpan from the north edge, darker soil from the old channel, compost he had started behind the shed, and a tray of tomato seedlings watered 3 different ways. No stage, no banner, no promise of miracle water. Rook took his place under the shed roof, where he could see everyone and be in no one's way. More people came than Wade expected. Some were small farmers with tired faces and hands cracked from work. Some were gardeners. Some were simply curious. Garin Holt stood near the back, with a paper cup of coffee he did not drink. Wade waited until the talking settled. Public speaking had never suited him. His throat tightened before the first words, and for a moment he almost wished the spring could speak for itself. Then Rook lifted his head, and Wade began. He told them the blue water was not magic. He told them not to drink it, just because a rumor had turned friendly. He showed them how to test soil texture with water and a jar, how to smell living soil, how to tell the difference between ground that needed minerals and ground that needed organic matter, how too much of a good thing could burn roots or wash away balance. He talked about compost, shade, drainage, patience. He showed the 3 trays of seedlings and admitted what he did not know. That mattered. People leaned in more when he stopped pretending certainty was the same as honesty. The spring does not replace work, he said, holding a handful of dark soil in his palm. It does not replace care. It does not replace learning your own ground. It helps the soil do what soil is made to do. If we stop treating it like dirt and start treating it like something alive. Mara wrote down names of people who wanted small test amounts. Dr. Renner explained limits, safe use, and why the spring should never be drained for quick profit. Nobody argued. Or if they did it quietly, which in Cedar Hollow counted as progress. Then Garin stepped forward. The benches creaked as people shifted to look at him. Wade felt his stomach tighten, not from fear, but from old habit. A man learns to expect certain voices to cut. Garin removed his hat. He looked at the trays, then at the bluff, then at Wade. I brought soil from my south field, he said, holding up a plastic bag. If you are willing, I would like you to look at it. The sentence was small. The room beneath it was not. Wade nodded. Garin's jaw worked once before he spoke again, and I need to say this where folks can hear it. I was wrong about this land. I was wrong about that water. He paused, and this time he looked Wade straight in the face. And I was wrong about Wade Mercer. No one clapped. It would have spoiled it if they had. The moment was too plain for applause. Wade felt heat rise behind his eyes and looked down at Rook, who had come to stand beside him without being called. That was the part people missed about dignity. It did not always arrive with victory. Sometimes it arrived when another man finally set down the story he had been carrying about you and made room for the truth. Wade took Garen's soil sample and held it carefully, as if it were worth something. Because it was. Not the dirt alone, but the trust inside the offering. "We can look at it," Wade said. "We can start there." And just like that, the Blue Spring stopped being Wade's secret and became Cedar Hollow's lesson. Years have a way of sanding the sharp edges off a place, but they do not erase what the place once was. 5 years after Wade Mercer signed the deed, almost nobody in Cedar Hollow called it Blue Scar Lot, unless they were telling the old version of the story. The new name had come slowly, the way names that matter usually do. First, Mara Voss wrote Glasswater Ground on a cardboard sign at the farmer's market. Then Dr. Renner used it in a soil workshop handout. Then Garen Holt said it at the feed store without making a face. After that, the name stayed. The land still had the same bluff, the same crooked pump shed, the same spring shining blue in the hollow below the stone. But the silence around it had changed. It was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence people used when they stepped close to something they had once misunderstood and did not want to insult it twice. Wade did not become rich. That disappointed a few people who liked their stories simple. Poor man finds strange water. Strange water makes him wealthy. Everyone who laughed is punished by success. Life had been kinder than that and harder than that. He made enough. Enough to repair the pickup, then replace it with another used one that started without prayer. Enough to put a real roof on the shed and build a small cabin beside it. Enough to pay taxes before the envelopes turned yellow. Enough to buy good dog food for Rook and decent coffee for himself. But the real value of Glasswater Ground was not in what it paid. It was in what it restored. On Saturday mornings, small farmers came with soil in jars and questions they were embarrassed to ask anywhere else. Wade showed them how to read texture, how to mix compost, how to use the Blue Spring water lightly, respectfully, never like a shortcut. A few adult veterans came too, men and women who did not want speeches about healing. They wanted something real to do with their hands. Wade gave them post holes, seed trays, irrigation lines, split rails, rows of beans that needed tying, tomato plants that needed suckers pinched. There was mercy in work that did not ask a person to explain every bruise inside them. There was dignity in watching something grow because you showed up for it every day. Rook grew old the way good dogs do, gradually and then all at once. His muzzle whitened, his hips stiffened. He stopped racing along the fence line and began choosing his steps with care. But each morning, he still walked to the upper seam in the limestone, the place where he had taken that first drink before Wade understood anything. He would lower himself beside it, nose toward the water, eyes half closed, as if keeping watch over the first truth he had found on that land. Wade built a low stone bench there. Beside it, he set a flat piece of limestone and carved the words by hand over 3 slow evenings. This water was never wrong. We were afraid of the color. Rook looked closer. Wade listened. He did not carve his rank. He did not carve the price of the land. He did not carve the yield numbers from Dr. Renner's reports or the market awards the tomatoes had won. Those things were not the heart of it. The heart was simpler. The spring had never changed its color to please Cedar Hollow. The land had never become something else to earn value. Rook had never waited for Wade to look successful before offering loyalty. Maybe people deserved that kind of seeing too, especially when they were still standing in dust with an old truck, a tired face, and one small chance in their pocket. Wade used to think he had bought 3 unwanted acres because he needed a place where nobody could make him leave. What he found was a place that taught him how many things get called worthless, only because nobody has been patient enough to understand them. Soil, water, silence, and a man trying to begin again. The blue spring kept flowing from the limestone, cold and strange and generous, carrying its quiet mineral load into the beds below. It had been there before the rumors, before the fear, before Wade, before Rook. It would be there after them too. And whenever someone stood beside it and asked how a $5 dead lot became glass-water ground, Wade gave the same answer. We stopped being afraid of the color. Then we started paying attention. If this story stayed with you, take a second to like the video and subscribe for more stories about people who were judged too soon. And tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest and where you're watching from tonight.